been suggested that if Jesus was actually invited to come and preach for us in a church like ours, he'd probably get up and tell a couple of stories to illustrate a point that he wanted to make. Well, I want to follow his example. I want to tell you a story. Now, you need to work with me on the story because it's not short, but it's profound. Once upon a time, there was an old man who was very poor. He was envied by the people of his village because he owned a beautiful white horse. People offered to pay a lot of money for the steed, but the old man always refused. "This horse is not a horse to me. It's a friend, not a possession. How could you sell a friend?" Well, one morning he found the horse was not in the stable. And the people of the village came to see him. "You old fool," they said. "We told you someone would steal your horse. How could you ever hope to protect such a valuable animal? It would have been better to have sold him. Now the horse is gone. You have been cursed with misfortune." Well, the old man responded, "Don't speak too quickly. Say only that the horse is not in the stable, because that's all we know. The rest is judgment. If I've been cursed or not, how can you know? All we can see is a fragment. Who can say what will come next?" Well, the people of the village, they laughed at the old man. They'd always thought he was a fool. If he wasn't, he'd have sold the horse and lived off the money. After 15 days, the horse returned. He hadn't been stolen. He'd simply run away into the forest. Not only had he returned, he brought a dozen wild horses with him. And once again, the village people gathered. "Old man, you were right and we were wrong. What we thought was a curse was a blessing. Please forgive us." The man responded, "Once again, you go too far. Say only that the horse is back. State only that a dozen horses returned with him, but don't judge. How do you know if this is a blessing or not? You see only a fragment. Unless you know the whole story, how can you judge? No one knows. I'm content with what I know. I'm not perturbed by what I don't." "Oh, maybe the old man's right," the people of the village said, but deep down, they knew he was wrong. They knew it was a blessing. With a little bit of work, the animals could be broken and trained and sold for much money. The old man had an only son. The young man began to break the wild horses in. But after a few days, he fell off one of the horses and broke both his legs. Well, once again, the villagers gathered around the old man and they cast their judgment. "You proved you were right. The dozen horses were not a blessing, they were a curse. Your only son has broken his legs, and now in your old age you have no one to help you. Now you are poorer than ever." The old man spoke again. "You people are obsessed with judging. Don't go so far. Say only that my son broke his legs. Who knows if it's a blessing or a curse? We only have a fragment. Life comes in fragments." Well, it so happened that a few weeks later, the country engaged in war. All the young men in the village were required to join the army. Only the son of the old man was excluded because he was injured. And once again, the people gathered around the old man, crying and screaming because their sons had been taken. There was little chance that they'd return. The war was a losing struggle. "You were right, old man," they wept. "This proves that your son's accident, it was a blessing. His legs may be broken, but at least he's with you. Our sons are gone forever." The old man spoke up again. "It is impossible to talk with you. You always draw conclusions. No one knows. Say only this: your sons had to go to war and mine did not. No one knows if it's a blessing or a curse. No one is wise enough to know. Only God knows." Let me ask you this question this morning. How do you understand the activity of God in your life? Is our faith in God merely a philosophy in which we believe? Or is it actually something that intersects with our everyday life? I mean, one of the major differences between Christianity and other religions around our world is the idea that God personally involves himself in the affairs of our lives. He's not distant. He's not aloof or unconcerned with what happens to us. The God that is described for us in the Bible is more like a close friend who cares for and involves himself in the everyday lives of his followers. So, in that light, let me ask, how's it going? How do we understand or perceive God's interests and activity in our lives? What's the value added in being a follower of Jesus? Because we live today in a very consumer-minded, conscious culture that makes this a fair question to actually ask. When we purchase a product, we expect it will work. We actually have laws that enforce this. If a consumer buys a product that is advertised to fulfill a particular function, and if it doesn't fulfill that particular function, legally we are entitled to get our money back. Wonder what would happen if we were to apply that principle to the idea of buying into Christian faith or being a follower of Jesus. As I say, the Bible says that Christians have this personal friendship with God, that he loves us incredibly. Jesus said that God cares so much about us, he even knows the number of hairs there are on our head. Which I have to say is a claim that used to impress me in the past a lot more than it does these days. But just saying. But that claim gives us as consumers the right to ask the question, how's it working? How helpful has it been? Because there are some people who have become a little disillusioned with God and the Christian faith because they wonder whether it is actually living up to all its promises. I mean, their basic assumption is that signing up with Jesus, that means everything is going to go well for me. And in particular, a relationship with God that puts a curb on negative stuff happening to us. In particular, avoiding suffering. I mean, if God is truly all-powerful, if he loves us like he says he does, then how come evil happens in our world? Why do good people get sick and die? Why do families split up? Or people with high mortgages suddenly lose their jobs? If God is so good and active in our world, they say, why are there so many disasters and tragedies and hatred and unhappiness? Where was God the other day when a mountain fell on innocent people? In a previous church where I was the pastor, people were asking this question back at the beginning of 2005. Remember that awful tsunami in Indonesia to Sri Lanka, across the Indian Ocean on Christmas? It was Boxing Day, wasn't it? 2004. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Of all the deaths, only 4 were from New Zealand. And 2 of those 4 were members of our church. And one of the 2 had been a member of our staff. Where is God's goodness when a couple who desperately want a child cannot conceive? Or when a young mother is killed by a drunk driver? I mean, these kinds of questions are very difficult to answer, right? On the one hand, the Bible does state that God is with us in everything that we encounter. But on the other hand, it also states that bad things do sometimes happen to good people and not so good people alike. Being a follower of Jesus is actually no immunity from suffering. However, what the Bible states is that what we call suffering can sometimes actually be a process of growth and transformation that God is actually doing in us. So this whole question about God's goodness in the midst of suffering, it's not new to our generation. When the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to a group of Christians who lived in the city of Rome, he offered them this perspective. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This particular verse, I mean, it's very well known, right? In fact, I don't know if we still do this, but in years past, people might even had this as a wall plaque or in their home, or maybe a bookmark that they had in their Bible. Very well known. But for all its well-knownness, it's also, I suspect, one of the most misunderstood and misused verses in the Bible as well. For some people, use this verse as a form of Christian fatalism. Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. God will always make everything work out for good in the end. Then others take Paul to be suggesting everything that happens to us in life must be God's will. Therefore, don't be sad. God will make your tragedy into happy and good. There are times when some well-meaning Christians can be actually really insensitive to the pain and the suffering of others. We had a close friend whose husband committed suicide. It came completely out of the blue, total ambiguity, no signs of mental illness or depression. He just simply jumped off the Auckland Harbour Bridge. And well-meaning Christian friends sent this verse to his widow in the hope it would be helpful, as if to imply, oh, don't be sad. God is in all of this, like everything. One day you'll look back on it and wonder what you got so upset about. Here's a little bit of pastoral advice for free. If you have a friend or a relative who is going through the grinder and you want to encourage them with this verse, be very, very careful. When Paul wrote his letter to the Roman Christians, it was at a time when the heat was actually being turned up on Christians. Persecution and opposition was beginning to mount. Being a follower of Jesus was actually something of a perilous deal. And Paul was definitely not saying that everything that happens to Christians is good. Nor was he suggesting that God is behind the suffering that they're enduring. Some Christians have used this particular verse as a kind of philosophical veneer that they paste over the top of painful episodes. Now the fact is, when Christians are beaten and oppressed, that's not a good thing. When a pregnant woman is killed in a car accident, or when a surgeon tells you, as happened to Liz some years ago, that the results identify breast cancer. When you lose your job or your spouse walks out on you, it's not the response of a genuine, mature Christian to simply rejoice as if to say, oh, well, everything will work out okay in the end. Romans 8:28. Grief and pain hurts. And there are definitely times when things do not appear to work out better, or for the comfort or the convenience or the prosperity of followers of Jesus. Paul was not suggesting here that everything that happens to us is good. Sometimes what happens to us is evil, and we're allowed to recognize that and call it for what it is. Likewise, not everything that happens to us was God's idea or plan either. There's a phrase in the insurance industry that has always bothered me, particularly when it comes to natural disasters like cyclones or earthquakes or flooding or slips on mountains in our city. Their term for this is to call it an act of God, as if God is responsible. Try telling that to the families of those whose loved ones were lost on Thursday morning. Now, what I think Paul was trying to say to a group of people who are becoming increasingly acquainted with pain and suffering is that God is bigger than our circumstance that we are in. God is able to use anything that we encounter in life as a tool or a mechanism for our good, even in those situations that are so bleak and hurtful. God is with us and can turn it into something that will grow us into better people. It may not have been his idea, and it may have been intended even for evil, but God can turn things around for good. I love the story of the poor widow who lived in an apartment building. The walls in between the apartments were kind of paper thin, and you could hear all sorts of things going on in your neighbor's apartment. Well, this elderly widow loved God deeply. Her landlord, on the other hand, despised God and this woman's faith, and he would often give her a hard time. Well, one day, the elderly widow simply ran out of food and had no money. No one to help her. She turned to God, she sat at a kitchen table and she prayed audibly, "Dear Lord, please help me in my time of need. I look to you for help. Please send me some food, for I'm tired and hungry." Well, the landlord, who despised God and her faith, listened through the wall and said, "I'll show her once and for all that her prayers to God don't do anything." So when the woman was out, he went out and brought a bag of groceries and used his landlord's access key, and he placed the bag of groceries on the kitchen table so that when she came back in, she saw this bag of groceries provided for her. And she got really excited, as you would. I mean, she danced around the kitchen table. She sang praises to God. She said, "Thank you, Lord. I cried out to you for help, and you have met my need and provided what I couldn't provide for myself." Well, the cynical old landlord fool had had enough of this, and he knocked on a door and came into her apartment, and the woman said, look, I prayed to God for food. I had no money or food, and look how God has provided." "You silly woman," he said. "God didn't provide that for you. I did." To which she said, "Oh, no. You're wrong and I'm right. God sent me these groceries, even if he had to send them by the devil." I mean, maybe one way to understand this verse, Romans 8:28, is to actually break it down kind of phrase by phrase. For instance, the verse begins with the words, "we know." I mean, one of the greatest benefits that we have as Christians, when we go through times of pain and suffering, is our sense of hope. But our hope is not in wishful thinking. "Oh, I hope it doesn't rain this afternoon." Or I hope Santa Claus will bring me this present. Now, our hope, Christian hope, is not based on positive or wishful thinking or natural optimism. Hope in a Christian sense is based on our knowledge of the truth. That God is, and that He is in complete control of our universe, and that He loves us. Now, Christian faith is not based on a theory or a philosophical proposition. It is actually based on God, who in the person of His Son, Jesus Christ, visited our planet and taught us the truth of God's kingdom. Our faith is rooted and defendable in the history of planet Earth. And whatever it is that gets thrown at us in life, we face it knowing that God is with us and will lead us through. That was Paul's testimony when he wrote one of his last letters, his second letter to Timothy, chapter 1, verse 12, when he said, "I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that He is able to guard what I have entrusted to Him for that day." Then the next phrase in the verse, that in all things. God is able to work with the experiences in our lives that have shaped us into the people that we are today. Even those times when God was excluded by us and we didn't seek His advice. Here is a neat truth about following Jesus. When God saves us, and when God restores us and restores our relationship with Him, there is absolutely nothing about us that He cannot use or redeem or turn into positive value. Think about that for a second. Nothing about our past is wasted. Maybe there are aspects of our past that we're actually deeply ashamed of. I can put my hand up for that. Maybe we made some dumb choices. I can admit to that. The neat thing about being a follower of Jesus is that nothing ever gets wasted. Our sins from the past, our failed marriages, our abortion, our violence, our grief, our bankruptcy, our illness, our being fired from the job, all things of our past that maybe no one else knows about are able to be used by God. He is the ultimate recycler of broken lives. That's a value added in being a follower of Jesus. The next phrase in Romans 8:28. God works for the good. Maybe another way of expressing that might be God is always on our side. In His permissive will, He will obviously, from time to time, allow the circumstances of life to wash over us, both good and bad. Rains on the just and the unjust, just the same. However, whatever we face, it is as if He is watching to see now what He can manufacture out of the ingredients and the components of our lives, good and bad. God can transform our circumstances, our hardships, or any difficulty we face into a life-transforming episode. I mean, think about this. When believers in the early days of Christianity suffered and died for their faith, how did they do that? When men were literally burned at the stake, that there are stories of martyrs who witnessed to the people who were lighting the pyre that would actually kill them. How do you do that? How do you stay positive and hopeful in the midst of suffering? Well, one way is to recognize that there might just be a bigger picture than the small piece of the jigsaw that we currently see. I love that account of bravery and faith on the part of those three young men that's described in Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as we learnt in Sunday school, shake your bed, make your bed, and into bed you go. They were thrown into the fiery furnace because they refused to bow down to the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar had put up. Now, with hindsight, we know God performed a wonderful miracle that day, and these three men survived. But at the time, they were prepared to die for the truth. Here's what they said to King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 3:16. We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Whatever it was that would happen to them or befall them, they knew that God would be with them and that God would use it for his glory. They may not avoid the pain, but whatever happened, it would be a tool in God's hand to produce something good. You know, there are lots of stories about Martin Luther, and some of them are true. The influential leader of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. He was a man mightily used by God in confronting the corruption of the Catholic Church in those days. But at one time, but Martin Luther was also given to times of deep and dark depression. We would probably class him today as bipolar. At one time, he got really down and depressed and locked himself away in a room, and he wouldn't come out for anything. His wife, Katie, former nun, by all accounts quite a feisty woman, tried to coax him out of the room, but with no success. And finally, in exasperation, Katie Luther put on a black veil, wore black gloves, a black dress, and went into the room where Martin Luther was hiding. And Luther looked at her and said, "Dear Katie, who has died?" She replied, "Why, God died, Martin." As the story goes, at this, Martin jumped to his feet in an outburst of emotion. He said, "That is blasphemy, woman. How dare you talk like that?" To which Katie replied, "Yes, it is, Martin. And so is the way you're living." At this point, Martin got up and ran out of the room, and as legend has it, it was within a very short time that he had penned the words to that mighty hymn that some of us might remember from years ago. "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, our helper he, amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing." I mean, isn't it the case that we so often resent having to go through pain and suffering? In one sense, I guess that's understandable. Unless you're a bit of a masochist, no one really likes hardship. Yet in another sense, we have such short memories. Because the Bible has a number of statements about how suffering and hardship can actually teach us things about life that all the good times in life will never teach us. We're all like mountaintops. Not a lot grows up there. Fruit trees grow in the valleys, not the mountaintops. And sometimes when we think of others, in our sense of mercy, we want to alleviate suffering for other people, as if it is always an absolute Christian virtue that it is the will of God that other people should be free from stress in life and not have to go through it. There's a story about a man who found a cocoon of the emperor moth, and he took it home in order to watch it emerge. And in his kitchen, it sat on a shelf, and he would look at it from time to time. And then one day, as he guessed the time for the moth to emerge from the cocoon, he sat and watched it for hours. He saw this tiny little wee aperture in the cocoon open up. And he watched the emperor moth trying and struggling to squeeze itself through the small aperture. And in the end, he felt there must be something wrong here. This shouldn't be so difficult. And so he took a tiny pair of scissors and he snipped the edge of the aperture and made the hole bigger, at which the moth emerged relatively quickly. But he watched the moth once it had emerged from the cocoon. He noticed the incredibly swollen body and the very weak and thin, shriveled up wings. He assumed that in time the wings would grow and the moth would fly around and what have you. Sadly, the short life of the now born, if we can say, or outer cocoon moth flopped around with its big body and limp wings. What he didn't realize was that in God's design and process, that tiny original aperture was a means by which the emerging moth would actually push fluid from its body into the wings. And so that they would have fortitude and strength to be able to fly. His merciful snip, can't have anybody suffering, was in reality cruel. Sometimes the struggle is exactly what we need. How did Paul put it in, or James, should I say, put it in James chapter 1, verse 2? He said, consider it pure joy. I want to ask him about this when I get to heaven. Whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Well, the writer of the book of Hebrews said, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Maybe you could tell my children that, who are now parents themselves. Or Romans 5, verses 3 and 4. We also rejoice in our suffering because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. Well, coming back to Romans 8:28, there is one more phrase that we need to consider. It's actually a caveat on the rest of the verse. It says, of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. Now, the Bible does not actually say that God works for the good of all people on planet Earth. This is a promise and a principle for those who love the Lord. Here, if you will, is the value added for the followers of Jesus. When we restore our relationship with God, we're adopted into his family, and we enjoy all the privileges and resources that comes of that. God is with us in whatever we face. However, that is not extended to those who reject the Lord or who stand aloof from him. In fact, you could even say all things work for bad for those who live in opposition to God and insist on doing things their own way. Remember that story Jesus told at the end of the Sermon on the Mount about the two people that built houses, one on rock, one on sand? When the storms of life come, the strength of them was directly proportional to the foundation on which they were built. So therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And I guess that raises an obvious question that only we can answer. What is the foundation upon which we are building our life for the future? I simply want to say, and I have no idea who this might apply to or not, But maybe today could be a good time to renew your resolve to live the rest of your days on the foundation of truth that is Jesus Christ and the wisdom of the Scriptures, and to become a part of the household of God. Is it time for you to open your account, as it were? Is it time to come back into the fold and build our future on the foundation and values that are God? Let me finish as I began with a story of an old man and a horse. A farmer owned an old mule. The mule fell into the farmer's well. The farmer heard the mule braying, or whatever it is that mules do when they fall into wells. And after carefully assessing the situation, the farmer sympathized with the mule, but decided that neither the mule nor the well were actually worth the trouble of saving. Instead, he called his neighbors together and he told them what had happened, and he enlisted their help, putting the mule out of its misery and filling in the well. Initially, the mule was hysterical. But as the farmer and his neighbors continued shoveling the dirt onto its back, a thought apparently struck the mule. It suddenly dawned on the mule that every time the shovel loads of dirt landed on his back, he should shake it off and step up. And this he did, blow after blow. Shake it off, step up, shake it off, step up, shake it off, step up. No matter how painful the blows or distressing the situation seemed, the old mule apparently didn't panic. He just shook it off and stepped up. And it wasn't long before the old mule, battered and exhausted, stepped over triumphantly the wall of the well. What seemed like it would bury him actually blessed him, and all because of the manner in which he handled his adversity. Let's pray together. Lord, we are fallen people who live in a fallen world, and we know what it means to struggle at times. We renew our hope in you. We are confident that you are who you said you are and who you have promised to be, now and in the future. And we say to you again that we will trust you to lead us and to guide us and to shape us, even from that which has crushed us, even by those things where we were the authors of our own destiny. May your grace abound, and may we be a community of hope that stands together and believes in what you can do for us in the future. In your hand we place ours, and into your care and keeping we place our trust. Amen.
And sing.